Okay, so now we're going to start on chapter 2, second week, first part of chapter 2. Okay, so Martin calls chapter 2 the nature of the beast, defining terrorism. Chapter 2 is about defining terrorism. Some of the definitional nuances have come to revolve around a statement: one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. And this statement has become very prominent in the definitional attitudes towards terrorism. We will talk about that statement a bit later on, but Martin in chapter 2 um, draws it, says that we draw a key distinction based on perspective: state sponsored terrorism and dissident terrorism. State sponsored terrorism occurred in World War II. These are some of the examples that he uses: Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin. And dissident terrorism can be defined by ideology, religion, ethnicity, geographic region, or another distinction, and it uses terrorist violence in a campaign to resist the government and its proxies. Almost any modern revolutionary organization may fit this description. And so, defining terrorism, again, it comes down to perspective. Before we go any further talking about defining terrorism, let's talk a little bit about extremism and extremists. So, we're going to talk about defining extremism, some common characteristics of violent extremists, and the world of extremists. Extremism is the foundation of terrorism. The fundamental source of terrorism is an extremist belief system that stresses intolerance. And this intolerance does not automatically translate to political violence, but it makes such violence more likely. Extremists are intolerant of what someone believes. They're intolerant in how someone expresses their beliefs. But violence is not a universal expression of extremism. And what that means is that all extremists don't necessarily become terrorists, whereas all terrorists harbor extremist beliefs. So, defining extremism. So, extremists hold beliefs that exceed the limits of what average people hold to be true, and it can manifest itself in many ways. Verbally, um, they write books, they write brochures, they have meetings, they have rallies. It's when they cross the line and use violence, such as the Ku Klux Klan did at one time and many other white supremacist groups, is when they fall into the category of becoming terrorists. But until they use violence, we still consider them to be extremists. Some common characteristics of violent extremists are intolerance, moral absolutes, broad conclusions, and new language and conspiratorial beliefs. Intolerance. The extremist beliefs are just and honorable, while those who do not share those beliefs may be labeled as unworthy or unclean, etc. Moral absolutes. A very clear distinction between good and evil is made. Broad conclusions. Extremists are socialized into a worldview that simplifies conclusions about the value of particular people. The truth is easy to derive, and many extremists have developed their own language loaded with judgments of others. The language can uphold elaborate conspiracies. So when we look at these characteristics, we can attribute them to certain groups that are operating worldwide or in the United States. Certainly, ISIS and white supremacist groups are intolerant. They have moral absolutes. They have broad conclusions. And white supremacist groups, particularly, espouse many, many conspiratorial theories. And These theories and these conspiracies, they're able to attract vulnerable people into their groups, and that ultimately that's what extremists try to do. They try to reach out with their views and to bring in people that are vulnerable and try to sway them to their cause. The world of the extremist. The worldview of the extremist is different, often fantastic, compared to the worldview of a non extremist. The basic belief that unjust forces are arrayed against true believers is one of the main concepts that they adhere to. They have a clear sense of mission, purpose, and righteousness. Perceptions employed by extremists may seem fantastical to an outsider. For example, the right wing belief that that the global financial system and the global media are controlled by Jews to serve the advancement of Judaism. And we often hear that in those extremist groups that believe that the media is controlled by Judaism. Religious extremists add the power of the supernatural to their beliefs, making their fantastical beliefs even more powerful because they assert that their actions have been mandated by God, or in the Middle East by Allah. Those extremists are fighting a jihad, a war, a religious war. So their war is backed by their God, and their God is giving them the power to fight that war.
When they first emerged in the mid 1990s, the environmental extremists, calling themselves the Earth Liberation Front, announced they were the burning rage of a dying planet. Ever since, the ELF, along with its sister group, the Animal Liberation Front, has been burning down everything from SUV dealerships to research labs to housing developments. In recent years, these so called eco terrorists have been responsible for more than 1,000 crimes, resulting in over $100 million in damage. And their tactics and rhetoric continue to escalate. Things have gotten so bad, the FBI now considers them the country's biggest domestic terrorist threat. This is the biggest act of eco-terrorism in U.S. history. A fire deliberately set on the night of August 1st, 2003, that destroyed this nearly completed $23 million apartment complex just outside San Diego. A fire set to protest urban sprawl.
It was the biggest fire I have ever responded to as a firefighter.
Jeff Carl is a division chief for the San Diego Fire Department.
That fire was not stoppable. At the stage that the fire was in when we arrived, there were problems in the adjacent occupied apartment complexes. Pine trees were starting to catch fire. Items on patios were starting to light up. And we had to direct our activity towards saving life before we could do anything about the property.
Hundreds were roused from their beds and evacuated. Luckily, nobody, including firefighters, was injured. By the time the fire burned itself out the next morning, all that remained was a 12-foot-long banner that read, "If you build it, we will burn it." Also on the banner was the acronym ELF. When you saw that banner, what went through your mind?
I knew I had a problem.
A problem because he knew what ELF stood for, the Earth Liberation Front, the most radical fringe of the environmental movement. It's the same group that set 9 simultaneous fires across the Vail Mountain Ski Resort in 1998 to protest its expansion, causing $12 million in damage. And the same group that left SUV dealerships across America looking like scenes from the Sunni Triangle, their way of protesting the gas-guzzling habits of American car buyers. The ELF is a spin-off of another group called the ALF, or Animal Liberation Front, whose masked members have been known to videotape themselves breaking into research labs where they destroy years of painstaking work and free captive animals. In recent years, they've capped off their visits by burning down the buildings. Still, they insist they are nonviolent.
For every arson that I've carried out, there's probably been 3 or 4 that were not carried out for that fear of injuring somebody.
Rod Coronado, a former ALF leader, is widely credited with introducing arson to the cause. He spent 4 years in prison for setting 6 fires, including this one at Michigan State University. But why burn a building down? Aren't you putting people at risk when you do that?
It's simply because after years of rescuing animals from laboratories, it was heartbreaking to see those buildings and those cages refilled within the following days. And for that reason, arson has become a necessary tool.
Coronado says the ALF and ELF operate in small, autonomous cells. How many people in a cell?
I usually worked with 5 or less people.
How do you decide after you've chosen a target to go about it? I mean, you just can't walk in the door.
Those are the types of things that take nights and nights and weeks of reconnaissance to ensure that you know in the 1 hour that you're going to take action that there will be absolutely no risk to any living being. The fact that nobody was ever injured in any of the actions that I've been accused of was not a coincidence.
Coronado says these days he's simply an unofficial spokesperson for the ALF and ELF. And in that role, he travels across the country giving lectures on the group's philosophies and tactics.
This is a crude incendiary device. Plastic jug, which you fill with gasoline and oil.
Many in law enforcement believe Coronado is still active in the movement as an organizer and recruiter. He recently found this GPS tracking device under his Jeep, which he believes was planted by the FBI. And he just happened to have a speaking engagement in San Diego the day after the fire. So you knew nothing about the fire?
I knew absolutely nothing about that fire.
But you have gone around the country and encouraged people to do this kind of thing.
Encouragement through explanation and demonstration of my own actions.
In other words, you show them how to set a fire.
I show them how I've set fires. I show them how the ELF and the ALF, what their mode of operation is.
So you're going out looking for people who will follow in your footsteps, footsteps that landed you in jail?
I'm asking for people courageous enough to take those risks for what they believe in.
We were surprised when one of those people, a man claiming to be an active ALF cell leader, came out of the shadows to grant what he called the group's first on-camera interview in 20 years, as long as we didn't see his face or record his voice. He told us that his cell has conducted operations from coast to coast, and every one of them was what he considered to be nonviolent because nobody was injured. He said under the mask is a normal, otherwise law-abiding citizen, and his friends and family have no idea about his activities. He said he thinks it's abysmal that the FBI considers them America's top domestic terrorist threat, because unlike neo-Nazi groups, the ALF has never hurt anyone.
Having the FBI chase you around is not a good thing.
John Lewis, a deputy assistant director for counterterrorism at the FBI, is the man charged with stamping out eco-terrorism in the United States. How many attacks are we talking about here?
Well, we're aware of over 1,000.
Lewis says the reason these groups are considered such a threat is because they've caused over $100 million worth of damage nationwide. And he says there are more than 150 investigations of eco-terrorist crimes underway. Have you caught the people who burned down those buildings on the mountain in Vail, Colorado?
No, sir.
What about the San Diego complex that was burned down?
No, sir.
How many of them have you actually caught?
We've had approximately 40 arrests or prosecutions.
Lewis says these groups use the internet to pass along information and to take credit for their crimes. He admits they're not in the same league as Al-Qaeda, but he says they're ratcheting up their actions and turning up the rhetoric.
There have been multiple statements made regarding assassination and or killing of individuals involved in, for instance, biomedical research and that kind of thing.
Case in point, Dr. Jerry Vlasic, practicing trauma surgeon in Los Angeles, who also acts as a spokesperson for several extreme animal rights groups. Vlasic has told audiences that it's time to consider assassinating people who do research on animals. You said, I think for 5 lives, 10 lives, 15 human lives, we could save 1 million, 2 million, 10 million non-human lives. You're advocating killing people.
I think people who torture innocent beings should be stopped. And if they won't stop when you ask them nicely, they won't stop when you demonstrate to them what they're doing is wrong, then they should be stopped using whatever means necessary.
Are you going to do this?
I'm not going to do that. I'm a physician. My role in the movement is not to go out and do that, but to explain to the mainstream media and to the public in general why these people are doing what they're doing.
So you want somebody out there, some impressionable young kid, to go out and kill somebody?
I want people who care about animals to do what's necessary to stop their exploitation, to stop their suffering.
And for someone who believes that the life of an animal is not akin to the life of a human being?
Those people are speciesists.
Speciesists, he says, are akin to racists or sexists. Animals, he says, should be accorded the same rights as human beings, despite their place on the food chain.
Just like at one time black humans were considered property. Well, dogs, cats, and all other animals in our society are still considered property.
Who's fair game?
Well, I think anybody that tortures animals for a living or for a profit, and who won't stop when they're asked to, and won't stop.
These are researchers who are performing tests using animals?
Animal researchers, slaughterhouse workers, the head of the corporation that slaughters hundreds of millions of chickens every single year for the taste of their flesh to sell to consumers.
People like chicken.
People liked owning slaves too, okay? That doesn't make it right.
Simple as that.
It's very straightforward in my mind.
We don't live in a country where it's okay to kill people if we don't necessarily like what they're doing. I mean, if we have someone who actively embraces this, then what's next?
What's next, he says, is the emergence of a lone wolf like Eric Rudolph or Ted Kaczynski, something that has already happened. These grainy images were taken by a surveillance camera. They show a mysterious bomber planting 2 sophisticated explosive devices late at night outside a company that makes vaccines in Northern California, a company targeted by animal rights activists. One bomb was set to go off an hour after the first, after firemen and police arrived, but it was spotted by a night watchman. A few weeks later, a 3rd bomb went off outside another company, this one strapped with nails.
Anyone within 50 feet of that particular bomb probably would have been killed or seriously injured.
The FBI's David Strange is in charge of the investigation. And the fact that one was set to go off an hour after the other one, what does that say to you?
To us, that indicated it was we call a secondary explosive, and that type of explosive is basically designed to hurt or kill the first responders that show up to the scene. Firemen,
Police,
firemen, ambulance, yes.
Had you ever heard of eco-terrorists using bombs before?
This was the first time.
Strange says the FBI has identified the suspected bomber, Daniel Andreas San Diego, a 27-year-old animal rights activist from San Rafael, California, who is now a fugitive after he slipped an FBI surveillance team. But he left behind a message posted on websites sympathetic to the Animal Liberation Front. Part of it reads, "We will now be doubling the size of every device we make."
I'll ask you, why does someone build an improvised explosive device with shrapnel, nails, and such, if they're not intending to cause someone grievous harm, if not worse?
There is a definite split in the movement when it comes to violence. After torching a forest research station in Irvine, Pennsylvania, one ELF cell threatened to, quote, pick up the gun. And the title of this animal rights tract says it all.
I think it's sort of disingenuous to say, well, we can burn down buildings, but we can't use explosives, or we can use explosives, but we can't do anything that might harm a person. I think what we have to do is look at the big picture. We have to look at what works.
The FBI and other law enforcement agencies are also looking at what works. They're winning longer prison sentences for convicted eco-terrorists, and they're pushing legislation in Congress that would make it a crime to threaten violence against any person or institution that uses that to do business.
So moving forward in defining terrorism, we're going to see that there's an ongoing debate. And in the next part, in part 2 of chapter 2, we're going to look at some of the common features of the definitions, the Homeland Security and American context of defining terrorism in the United States, the types of terrorism, and we're going to find that there is no single definition of terrorism that has been adopted widely. Government institutions and political researchers are in a habit of choosing from the more than 100 existing definitions already published or developing their own from components of definitions. And in the second part, we'll see some of the different definitions by law enforcement, government agencies, and entities that have attempted to define terrorism. So we'll see that in the next part.